On January 10, 2011, at approximately 4:30 p.m, a wall of water between 8 and 9 metres high moved through the town of Grantham in Queensland's Lockyer Valley. Witnesses described it as a brown wall, moving faster than a person could run, carrying everything that had been standing in the valley minutes before. In less than an hour, 12 people in Grantham were dead. The Lockyer Valley had flooded catastrophically in 1893 and in 1974, and it would flood again in 2022. The same geography, the same catchment, the same wall of water. Every few decades, the Lockyer Valley does exactly what its geography says it will do. And every time it does, Australia is surprised. This video is not about floodwaters. It is about the failures that happened before the floodwaters, the planning decisions, the infrastructure choices, the warnings not issued, the recommendations not implemented, the institutional habits that allow the same disasters to recur in the same places with the same official surprise. Australia is the driest inhabited continent on Earth. It is also the continent where flooding kills more people and causes more economic damage per capita than almost any comparable nation. A landscape that receives almost no rainfall for years, and then receives years of rainfall in days, produces flooding of extraordinary violence. The preparation has, historically, been inadequate. Number 1 is a finding that applies to every flood in this video. It is not a natural phenomenon. It is a policy choice. Subscribe. Turn on notifications. And let's begin. Number 12. The 1893 Brisbane flood. In February 1893, Brisbane flooded 3 times in 3 weeks. The city was young, established only 60 years before, and flood infrastructure did not exist. The Brisbane River rose to levels not matched for nearly a century. The Valley, South Brisbane, and the riverside districts were under metres of water. 35 people were killed. The 1,893 floods produced reports and recommendations. They produced a clear understanding, in the engineering records of the time, that Brisbane was a flood city, that the river would do this again, and that the city needed to be planned accordingly. The pattern established in 1893, a catastrophic flood occurs, reports are produced, recommendations are made, some improvements are implemented, the urgency fades, development continues in flood-prone areas, and the next flood arrives to repeat the process. Brisbane flooded again in 1974. It flooded again in 2011. Each time, the damage was shaped by development that had occurred in the floodplain in the intervening decades. Each time, official surprise accompanied a flood the historical record had predicted. The 1893 flood is on this list because it is the beginning of the pattern, the first proof that Australia had identified its flood problem and chosen not to solve it. Number 11. The 1955 Maitland flood, Hunter Valley, New South Wales. On February 25, 1955, the Hunter River at Maitland reached 11.87 metres. The flood killed 25 people and produced damage equivalent to hundreds of millions in current values, the worst in the Hunter Valley's recorded history. Maitland was established in 1818 beside the Hunter River, the same river that would periodically destroy it. The 1955 flood produced Morpeth Levee, an earthen bank to protect central Maitland. The levee provided protection. It also changed the development calculus for land behind it. Floodplain became developable. The levee created a sense of protection that was, depending on the event size, partially justified or completely inadequate. Maitland is one of the clearest examples of how flood mitigation infrastructure can paradoxically increase the eventual damage it was built to prevent, by enabling development that, without the levee, would never have occurred. Number 10. The 1974 Brisbane flood. On January 26, 1974, Australia Day, the Brisbane River flooded for the first time since 1893. 81 years had passed. Brisbane had grown substantially on the floodplain the 1893 disaster had clearly identified as flood-prone. The 1974 flood killed 16 people and inundated over 13,000 properties. It was extensive because the floodplain was extensively developed, because 81 years of dry conditions and faded institutional memory had produced a city that did not behave as though it knew it lived beside a river that would periodically destroy it. The Wivenhoe Dam was the response, approved after 1974, completed in 1984, the largest flood mitigation project in Queensland's history. It represented the standard Australian institutional response: build infrastructure, enable the next wave of development, move on. The dam worked for 37 years. In 2011, it was overwhelmed. The management of the dam became the subject of a specific inquiry whose findings described decisions about dam releases that had contributed to the downstream flood impact. Brisbane flooded again. The dam had enabled decades of development. The development increased the damage when the dam was overwhelmed. Number 9. Cyclone Tracy's flood surge. Darwin, 1974. Cyclone Tracy is remembered primarily as a wind event. The cyclone that destroyed Darwin on Christmas morning 1974 with winds of over 200 kilometers per hour. But Tracy also produced a flood surge that inundated Darwin's coastal and low-lying areas in ways the city was entirely unprepared to handle. Tracy killed 71 people. The surge's precise contribution to that death toll is not established with the same clarity as the wind damage. The comprehensive destruction made forensic accounting difficult, and the official narrative focused on wind. Darwin was rebuilt with stringent cyclone-resistant construction standards that have demonstrably reduced structural damage in subsequent events. The flood infrastructure received less sustained attention. Subsequent development in low-lying areas has maintained the city's flood vulnerability. The cyclone-resistant buildings are real. The flood exposure of the land beneath them is also real. Number 8. The Grantham Inland Tsunami, January 2011. At approximately 4:30 p.m. on January 10, 2011, the Lockyer Valley catchment, swollen by days of intense La Niña rainfall, released a concentrated surge into the narrow valley floor. The surge moved through Grantham at a speed witnesses described, uniformly, as a wall. 8 to 9 meters. Faster than running. 12 people died in less than an hour. The specific feature that distinguishes Grantham from a simple flood event is the inland tsunami characteristic. The way catchment geometry concentrated flood energy into a fast-moving surge rather than a slow-rising inundation. This had been identified in hydrological research on the Lockyer Valley. The steep ranges feeding into a narrowing valley were known to produce fast-moving surges in major rainfall episodes. The Queensland Floods Commission of Inquiry found that the warning system had not operationalised the surge risk, treating the valley's flood risk as slow-rising inundation when the evidence supported a fast surge characterisation. The difference between those two risk profiles determines how much warning time residents need. The profile in the planning gave more time than the event produced. Number 7. The 2011 Brisbane flood and the Wivenhoe question. The January 2011 Brisbane flood inundated over 25,000 properties and caused an estimated $2.5 billion in damage, the worst Brisbane flood since 1974. The dam was full when the 2011 rainfall arrived. The operators faced a decision: release water to protect the dam's structural integrity while minimizing downstream flooding, or hold longer and risk a more catastrophic uncontrolled release. They chose to release. The Flood Commission of Inquiry found that at certain points, the operators had not complied with the Flood Mitigation Operating Manual, that actual releases at critical periods were higher than prescribed. The operators disputed the Commission's interpretation. The dispute went to the courts. The legal process was complex and contested. What is not contested? The 2011 Brisbane flood was shaped in part by decisions about how to operate the dam. The dam was built to protect Brisbane. Brisbane flooded with the dam. The question of how those two facts relate has not been fully and finally answered. Number 6. Lismore, February-March 2022. The Northern Rivers region experienced two major flood events within 3 weeks. The first, on February 28, broke the Lismore flood gauge record that had stood since 1954. The second, on March 30th, came before the community had recovered. The February 28 flood peaked at 14.37 metres, higher than any recorded flood in Lismore's history. The warning system gave residents insufficient time to evacuate. People were trapped as the water rose faster than forecast models predicted. Community members in private watercraft conducted rescues formal emergency services could not reach in time. The subsequent inquiry found systemic failures. Forecasting models for the Wilsons River had not been updated. Evacuation planning had not accounted for the speed at which the river could rise. Communication had been inadequate. Lismore's flood risk was not new information. The community's grassroots rescue response was extraordinary, and it was the consequence of official systems that were not adequate to the event. Number 5. Darwin's 2023 flooding and the infrastructure gap. In late 2023, Darwin experienced significant urban flooding following intense monsoonal rainfall, a moderate episode that inundated established suburbs across the city. The 2023 events revealed a specific gap. The stormwater infrastructure had not kept pace with the city's expansion. New suburbs had been developed in areas where natural drainage had been disrupted. The impervious surfaces of urban development concentrate runoff rather than absorbing it, increasing flood impact compared to the undeveloped landscape. Darwin had been told about this gap. Infrastructure audits had identified the stormwater deficit and recommended investment. The investment had been partial. Nobody died in 2023. But the events demonstrated that the rebuilt Darwin, the city of cyclone-resistant buildings, had a flood vulnerability that its development trajectory was increasing rather than reducing. The infrastructure gap remains. Number 4. Floodplain development and the policy choice that creates the pattern. Every flood in this video has a common element that precedes the water: development in floodplains. The decision to allow construction in areas known to be flood-prone is the foundational failure behind every Australian flood disaster. This is not a natural disaster problem. It is a planning problem. The water creates damage because people and properties are in its path. They are there because planning decisions allowed it. The planning frameworks that govern Australian land use have, since European settlement, permitted development in floodplains. The motivations are multiple: land value, housing supply pressure, revenue for local governments, the political difficulty of denying approvals, the temporal distance between planning decisions and the floods that validate or invalidate them. The people who approve a development in a floodplain will typically not be in office when the flood arrives. The costs, emergency response, property damage, trauma, death, are borne by residents, by governments funding recovery, and by insurance markets that respond by withdrawing coverage from flood-prone areas. The National Flood Insurance Review following the 2022 Lismore floods found that insurance was becoming unavailable in some of Australia's highest flood risk communities. The market was pricing the risk that planners had consistently refused to acknowledge. Number 3. The floods that are coming. The climate science is specific. Rising temperatures are intensifying the water cycle. More evaporation, more precipitation, more intense and more frequent extreme rainfall events. For a continent whose flood patterns are already driven by extreme rainfall, the trajectory is toward more frequent and more severe flooding. Bureau of Meteorology projections describe increasing intensity of extreme rainfall events across most of the continent. The regions that have historically produced the most destructive floods, the Queensland coast, the northern rivers of NSW, the Hunter Valley, Victoria's floodplains, the top end, are projected to experience more intense events as the baseline warms. The infrastructure Australia has built was designed for historical climate patterns. As those patterns change, dams will face higher frequency extremes than they were sized for. Levees will face events exceeding their design level. Drainage systems will face intensities beyond their capacity. This is the flood future Australia is entering, with floodplain development continuing, insurance markets withdrawing, and infrastructure designed for a climate that no longer describes the conditions it must manage. Number 2. The recommendations that keep being made and not implemented. Every Australian flood disaster produces an inquiry. Every inquiry produces recommendations. And then, with a consistency that is itself worthy of an inquiry, the recommendations are partially implemented, the urgency fades, development continues, and the next flood produces the next inquiry and the next recommendations. Why does this cycle continue? Flood mitigation is expensive. The benefits are distributed across a long time horizon. Investment today reduces damage from a flood arriving in 5 years or 50. The costs are immediate. In the political cycle, immediate costs are difficult and deferred benefits are invisible. The people who live in floodplains are constituents. They vote. Planning restrictions that reduce the value of their flood-prone land are politically difficult. Flood mitigation infrastructure competes with other spending priorities. Institutional memory fades faster than the political cycle that might fund prevention. The result is a system very good at responding to floods and consistently inadequate at preventing them. One that funds enormous emergency response operations and then allows the conditions for the next emergency to continue developing. The recommendations from 2022, from 2011, from 1974 are all in the public record. They addressed the same problems. They have been addressing the same problems, in different words, for over a century. Number 1. The failure that connects every flood in this video. The failure is not incompetence. The warning systems, the emergency responders, the engineers, the inquiry commissioners, these are serious people doing their jobs with real professionalism. The failure is systemic. It is built into the political economy of how Australia manages its relationship with water. Australia allows people to live in floodplains. It always has. The land is fertile, the river access is valuable, the views are beautiful, and the floods are infrequent enough that each generation must rediscover the risk that the previous generation documented in a report now filed and partially acted upon. The failure behind every flood in this video. Australia treats floods as natural disasters rather than as the predictable consequences of knowable risks. When floods are natural disasters, the appropriate response is emergency management, responding after the event. When floods are predictable consequences of knowable risks, the appropriate response is prevention, not allowing people and properties to occupy the predicted flood path. Australia has never fully made the transition from the first framing to the second. It has moved toward it, incrementally, through each inquiry and recommendation cycle. But the movement has been slower than the development of the floodplains it is trying to protect. The 2022 Lismore flood exposed something already known, that parts of Australia are becoming uninsurable, that the market is withdrawing from the highest risk areas, that the planning frameworks that created those areas have not been fundamentally reformed. More floods have not been sufficient to make the transition. The 1893 Brisbane flood identified the problem. The 2022 Lismore flood identified the same problem. The floods between them identified the same problem at every interval. The failure is not the water. The failure is the choice to keep placing people and properties in its path and then being surprised when it arrives. Share this video. Subscribe. Read the inquiry reports. They are public documents. The failures behind the floods are documented in them. And they are waiting, patiently, for the next flood to demonstrate that they have not been addressed. See you in the next one.